me, I'm very much, I'm here's a problem. Let's take care of it. I have a solution for that.
Our goal when we opened was to provide the highest quality care that was possible at a price people could afford.
I literally talk to physicians daily. Kelly, I can't even log in to see my own billing. I have no idea what's going on. I get a report once a month and nobody can explain it to me. I make it a point to train the physicians how to go and pull their own report.
I'm going to be on the course reporting tomorrow afternoon.
You are?
I am. I'm going to follow Jordan Spieth and Will Zalatoris and Scotty Scheffler. I'm not really reporting, but I am going to go watch the course.
Probably drink a couple beers.
Yeah, I might have a beer or two tomorrow afternoon. I mean, that would make my commentary even better.
Hey everybody, welcome to this week's episode of the Cutting Edge Podcast. This ought to be interesting.
I hope so. And you know what's weird is I'm not sitting next to you today, so I don't know about this whole being this far apart. You think our guest is going to get overwhelmed with being in between us?
No.
Okay.
No. So this week's episode is on the No Surprises Act. So for those of us in healthcare, this is nearly a year in the making. New federal legislation revolving around surprise medical billing that is ready to go into effect January 1, 2022. So we've actually got Chris Reed from Weaver Johnston Nelson joining us today as our guest. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So, as exciting as attorneys can be when they speak shop is what we're going to have today. But before we get started, we got to do our usual shout outs to the folks that have helped us get here. So to TexAssist, Carrington Group, Ortho Lone Star, in this episode, Weaver Johnston Nelson, Gordon Highlander, all folks that have helped us get here. And of course, Jen Eaton with Moonshot Marketing Group to help us with all of our social media outlets and setups.
Gordon next week, right?
Yeah, we're actually having Gordo on to talk about driving a culture of success.
I've only met Gordon one time, but everybody should buckle up next week. I think it'll be highly entertaining.
Absolutely. So, people always ask, how do you find us? So you can find us on Facebook. You can find us on LinkedIn. You can find us on Twitter. You can find us on Instagram. We do not TikTok. We do not Snapchat.
We don't?
Now, Tyler, my wife said,
oh my God,
it is up to you.
And I really like Leisha way more than CJ too.
To come up with,
weird.
She said, you and your wife must come up with a TikTok dance for Halloween.
Oh, done. My wife is way over the top about Halloween. I mean, she's already pre-planning like weeks in advance. So we'll get that done. Can Luke be involved?
Well, of course.
Okay, so we have a TikTok dance. Is there like a theme that needs to come with it?
Well, it's Halloween, so I assume y'all are.
But I'm saying, like, does it have to have a cutting edge theme or just
no? Just whatever.
Oh, done. But that means I have to sign up for a TikTok account.
Well, we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, that 5th or 6th email address comes in handy.
Yeah. So, in terms of being able to actually listen to these podcasts, you can find us on Apple Podcasts. You have to look up the Cutting Edge Podcast.
Yes.
Same thing with Spotify. You can find us on YouTube as well. Lots of different ways to find us. So, without further ado, let's jump in. So, again, Chris, you've been an attorney how many years?
This month it'll be 21.
Wow. So healthcare been your primary area of specialty your whole career?
Over the last 5 years, that's been my sole area of focus. Primarily reimbursement issues for providers or commercial litigation, solely involving representation of people in the medical sphere, be that practices, individuals, ASCs, or investors in different healthcare providers. I started off actually though at a big international firm doing commercial litigation and insurance coverage, and it was that insurance coverage part, surprisingly, that moved me into the healthcare area.
Interesting. So this legislation then really is right in your little niche of specialty. I suspect that you probably had a serious influx of emails and phone calls over the past several months as this has started to develop. What has your universe looked like and felt like
Yeah.
as this has started to come to fruition.
Yeah, the bill was passed, if you recall, at the very end of December last year. And it got a little traction, a little attention. We had some questions at the beginning of the year as people were coming back from the holiday season and trying to catch up on what had been going on. But at that point, there had been no regulations, no rules on how the actual statute is going to work in real life for providers or for health insurance plans and ERISA plans. And so really over the last 2 to 3 months, especially, our client base is providers, people have really gotten excited about what this is going to mean for them as they begin to look at the implementation date of January
You
1st.
just
Excited.
Yeah,
That's
I
what
was just
heard.
gonna
So
say.
you're excited?
Yeah, I heard
because I haven't
excited.
heard a lot of excitement about this.
Well, excited can come different ways.
Yeah, okay.
Some people are excited because they don't really appreciate what's about to be hoisted upon them. And others are excited because they think it actually could benefit
This happens
them.
often to me when CJ comes to play golf. I'm excited about playing golf with him, but then what gets hoisted on me is not great.
Well, Chris, let's start unpacking this a little bit. So, one of the key questions that I had was, with this legislation being passed at the end of last year, for our audience, when is this legislation expected to go into effect? And is this state legislation? Is it federal legislation? Help us unpack that.
Right. This is federal legislation. It was passed by the U.S. Congress. It was signed by President Trump into law. And the Biden administration over the last 10 months now have been developing a series of regulations for implementation of the act. Unlike other areas where the different department secretaries might have some flexibility on implementation of the act, the Congress said this act will go into effect on January 1st. Now, there are certain provisions related to price transparency that also kind of dovetail into another bill that was passed several years ago requiring hospitals to start making available to the public their charge master, their price list, if you will. The different departments with relevance and enforcement for this have all said we're not going to begin enforcing those price transparency components of No Surprises until I believe it's July of 2022. But other than that, unfortunately, the part that, gets people paid, it is going to go into effect January 1st.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm looking at this look on your face, like, holy crap, that's a lot to digest, Tyler.
Actually, I'm thinking something different. Believe it or not, I'm as the average Joe and consumer, I hear the term price transparency, and I go, what does that really mean? Because as the consumer, I'm going, tell me about price transparency, because most of what I experience isn't all that transparent. So tell us about that.
Yeah, no, I think that has been, and I'm a big consumer of healthcare. I think most people, if you have a doctor that you go to for an annual physical, or, heaven forbid, you actually have some chronic condition, you've had some experience with being billed by a doctor and receiving either an EOB, an explanation of benefits from the health insurer, which kind of levels out what they paid and what they expect you as the insured to pay. And then also the provider may send you a bill, depending upon what type of service you're having.
And then ask me to request a UA and an EOB, which happens oftentimes, but we won't go down that soapbox.
Right. and if we want to think about where all of this came from, starting about 5 years ago, maybe a little more, the big payers started requiring all of the different healthcare providers, especially out-of-network providers, to begin to reasonably collect the patient's deductible, co-insurance, or other cost-sharing obligations that the patient may have. Now, this was in part driven by the ACA. As we moved people into getting insured, we also wanted patients to be sensitive to the amount that healthcare was costing them and the insurance company. And so by increasing the patient's copay, co-insurance, or deductible, especially for out-of-network care, we began seeing what people started calling surprise bills, or what in the industry is also known to as balance billing.
So, Chris, this bill was just shy of 500 pages when it was passed by Congress. Can't imagine that anybody actually read all 500 pages of the people who voted on it. So help us understand all the different provider types that were actually affected by this legislation that need to have their antenna up and seriously have an understanding of this going into January 1.
Absolutely. The sausage making process of legislation is never a pretty one. And that's definitely true for the No Surprises Act, as the protections against patient balance billing is called. If you recall, it seems like now over the last 6 years, Congress rarely, if ever, is able to get a majority of anyone together to pass things.
Really?
Sometimes even our budget. I know, it's shocking. And so at the end of, after the election, at the end of the year last year, you actually had a lot of different stakeholders who needed to get some appropriations done. And because there was large support politically for protecting patients from these out-of-network bills, and federal politicians had seen different states try to protect their citizens in different ways, they actually came together and were able to slide in to the Consolidated Appropriations Act, the No Surprises Act, and that's found in Title I of what's otherwise an appropriation bill. And then there are different parts of the protections for patients, some changes to ERISA, some changes to other aspects of how people are supposed to pay into the system on things that are governed by federal law.
So dumb.
Well, so again, I think go back to the core question of what provider types
Sure.
or what specialties, so to speak, are really the ones that have to be tuned in to this potentially impacting their business the most.
Right. If you are a provider that's going into a hospital, an ambulatory surgery center, a critical access hospital, or a hospital outpatient department, and you're providing an item or service and you're out of network and that facility is in network, then that provider needs to be concerned about the law.
That's interesting because I just realized that this essentially doesn't touch primary care providers.
That's right. I was going to say it's almost easier to say who doesn't need to be worried about this. And it's, your family care doctors or your primary care physician, people who aren't going to go and do surgeries or a procedure. Or if you're the type of specialist, and this might not be fair, let's say though an endocrinologist who you're more interested in diagnostics, you're not necessarily going to go cut someone's pancreas out. You don't have to really be as worried about that. Whether you're in or out of network, these protections and requirements won't apply to you.
So just while we're on that topic, so the anesthesiologist that walks into a delivery room and decides that he's going to sit there and administer all the things that he administers, and he's out of network, he's going to be impacted by this, right?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, he would probably fall into the category of who's most impacted, going back to your question.
Because CJ knows my story about this.
Yeah.
I mean, being in-network OBGYN for my wife and, obstetrics, office, and then I'm in an in-network hospital of which I'm supposed to deliver the child, and then I get a $17,000 bill for anesthesia. Now, it all worked itself out. But should the consumer ever get a $17,000 bill when you're in an in-network hospital with an out-in-network provider? Probably not.
And then be caught in the middle of the negotiation between
Correct.
an insurance company that's making billions of dollars each quarter.
Yeah. See, it's coming full circle
and,
now. I knew I was
yeah.
the reason I was
Provider.
on this podcast.
Yeah. Well, and the goal of Congress, despite what we might think of either party at any given time, both parties did want to protect patients from that exact scenario. The worst case scenario, you're a patient, you have an emergency, you have zero choice on where you're going to go, and then you get all of these bills from anesthesiologists and others, radiologists, emergency care physicians, and then the hospital. The hospital's in network, you don't care. Everyone else out of network, and it can be $10,000+.
Okay, so here's a question from me. Does it matter whether you're the treating physician or you're being called in by the treating physician to render care? Is there any differentiation in this legislation, or does it just not matter?
It almost doesn't matter. The reason why, and again, I'm not a member of Congress, so I'm kind of just reading tea leaves and in between lines, is I think that just like the Texas legislature, when they adopted the Texas version that's similar to this, they were worried that patients were going to get stuck into a coercive situation where they didn't have a choice over the actual provider that was giving the specific service. So while they might have chosen the surgeon, they didn't necessarily get to say who my anesthesiologist was going to be, my radiologist, my surgical assistant, and all the way down the lines, my intersurgical neuromonitoring, and so they were getting bills from people that they might not have picked. They might have gone with someone else who was in network. And so this is balancing that field for the patient so that the patient doesn't have any financial responsibility or harm when those out-of-network providers get involved in providing that care. That's true whether it's emergency care or in also situations of non-emergency care that's provided at an in-network facility that involves out-of-network providers.
Got it. So, let's talk about the actual provisions. And, we've had many conversations about the specific provisions and kind of, are there certain provisions that are more important than others? And I guess really what provisions in your opinion are most significant in this legislation that providers really need to be worried about?
I think, they fall into 3 or 4 types. The first type is that the federal legislation, which applies to 85% of all insurance claims or health benefit plan claims that are going to be submitted, requires providers with a very kind of, in my opinion, tight time frame to give good faith price estimates for the services that are going to be provided. While Texas law had some requirements around giving price estimates, they are not as meaty as the federal requirements. So I think that's one.
So talk about that for a second. So how wide is the estimate when you're talking about estimates? Are we talking about like we got to be within like a few $100s, a few $1,000s, a few $1 million? I mean,
so this is where politicians give and politicians take away, right? So they give you the price estimate. They say it has to be in good faith, but that definition of good faith between the statute and the regs looks like it has to be around 300% of what the original estimate was. So there's still a lot.
So, whoa.
I know.
I want to hear that again. 300%.
Right.
So if it's $1,000 procedure, technically you could be somewhere between $0 and $3,000, or actually, depending on how you work the range, you could be off $2 or $3 grand there. If it's $100,000 procedure, you could be off a few $100,000.
That's right. And I don't know about you, but like when I'm doing my monthly planning, I don't really have a medical budget that allows it to vary 200 or 300% from what I expected.
Me neither. And that's why politicians shouldn't be have their hands in things that they don't know anything about. But anyway, that is what it is.
The good news, though, is, because I always like to have some good news with some scary stuff, is that what we're talking about right now, as bad as it is that these are only interim rules and the bill goes into effect on January 1st, from what I'm hearing, people really are participating in the comments to the different 3 agencies that have responsibility for enforcement.
And what are those 3 agencies?
You have Treasury that's responsible for a portion of it. You have Labor that's responsible for the ERISA portion. And then you have HHS, specifically CMS within HHS, that's responsible for basically everything else. And that makes sense if you think about what those different agencies have responsibility for.
Sure.
I think
so
that
good faith estimate is one, and that's prior to surgery.
Correct.
So what's the time frame that somebody has to be able to deliver that good faith estimate prior to surgery?
Right. If the provider is a non-participating provider, they're out of network at an in-network facility, then if the appointment is scheduled 72 hours before that appointment is when they need to give the estimate. If the appointment is scheduled within 72 hours, then you have to give the estimate within 3 hours of the providing the service or the item. And so it doesn't give a lot of time either for the provider or the patient, in my
To make
mind.
a choice.
Yeah.
Or
yeah.
or to say, you're out and I want somebody else, right?
So,
That's right.
yeah, it's like okay, I walk into a provider, no matter if it's an emergency room or a doctor's office, and I'm in a tight or bad situation. I need help. I mean, give me a break. I mean, so you've got basically, hey, time's ticking, Tyler. This is how much it's going to cost. I mean, reality of it is I've got to get the services.
Right.
So I think there's more leeway in the 72-hour in advance piece, because if I'm going to schedule surgery 30 days in advance or 60 days in advance, that makes more sense. But I mean, a 3-hour time frame for something that wasn't planned.
Yeah. Yeah.
To me, that's going to be difficult to enforce, but it is what it is.
Yeah, to me, being in the spooky season and looking forward to seeing your Halloween dance on
Apparently,
TikTok.
I got a TikTok.
To me, this is one of the tricks that are in the bill that really could be a treat if they had given the deadlines a little bit more generously.
Yeah.
As a person who's been involved in litigation or arbitration with insurance companies looking at their failure to pay or underpayment on healthcare claims, even the most strenuous judge doesn't have deadlines like the ones that the agencies have put in place for either the IDR process, the arbitration process to get at the final payment, or any of the kind of preliminary deadlines between the provider and the patient providing the cost estimate. And then the other important protection we should talk about, which is the ban on balance billing of the patient. And if you're okay, I'll just kind of dive in and keep talking.
Keep going, right? Because where I think this is what the majority of people who are going to tune in for this is what they want to know. Like, can I reasonably? It sounds to me like we're getting into a situation where people have to balance compliance and complexity of administrative burden with being out of network.
Right. I think that's true. And the other thing to think about too, and it's different state to state, is what are your different states' laws for dealing with a provider's network inadequacy? Because if we're trying to push people in network or make claims be in network, well then in my mind, the payers need to make sure that those networks are robust, and so that you have a variety of provider types in different geographic locations that give reasonable competition for the patient. And I'm not really sure that from what I'm hearing right now, the different payers are, open with their networks.
Yeah, I can tell you from a surgical assistant standpoint, it's horrendous. There is a huge gap. So if we get any legislators that listen to this and you have any influence over looking into this, you need to, because somebody needs to kick the payers in the rear end. It is wildly missing the mark, and the payers are not being held accountable for this portion of the legislation. And I'll get off my soapbox now.
No, I think you're right on that too. Texas several years ago implemented a similar but different system that has some out-of-network protections against balance billing, as well as an arbitration style dispute resolution for when a health insurer doesn't pay or doesn't pay what was billed. The federal plan builds off of that, but is a little different, both in terms of how that arbitrator, which we call an IDR.
Yeah, and actually, I'm going to pause for a second.
Sure.
So we talked about good faith estimate. I think the next question, because I had actually one of my friends that's a practice administrator call me today and asked me about patient consent. Can you speak to patient consent rules and guidelines and whether or not that influence whether a provider can actually bill out of network?
Sure. So the tri-agencies are putting together or have come together and put out a consent form that providers have to utilize to obtain patient consent to balance bill. And so just to kind of not talk legalese for a second, the way that this works, unless you get the consent, is that the patient can't be balance billed. Whatever the insurance company says their deductible is, or if they have a co-share or co-insurance amount, whatever the insurance company says is it, that's it, and you can't go for what your bill charges would have been above what was actually paid. And so this creates, very strong protections for patients in these out-of-network situations, because unless the provider jumps through the hoop the default rule is that the patient is protected. And so for the federal legislation, just like the state one, there's a very specific form with specific language the statute requires.
Which is very, very negative, puts the provider in a very negative light, by the way.
Yes, and also has to be provided in certain, or have available in certain circumstances in up to 15 different languages, which I think, I did not go back and look at this before we came and started recording, but I think that's even more than the Medicare non-discrimination provisions require. And then again, kind of with the charges estimate that we had talked about, the consent form also needs to be obtained in that 72 hours before the service is provided, or 3 hours before the service is provided if it was scheduled within 72 hours. And absent that, the provider, cannot go after the patient above those identified deductible coinsurance amounts.
Wow. So if a provider wants to be out of network and they want to say, to hell with it, I don't want to have to go and get those documents. I don't want to have to get the patient to sign a consent form. And they go and they drop a bill to the insurance company out of network. What happens?
Then the process, as you know it, generally kicks in. The insurance provider will take the HCFA, however it's submitted, it'll process it, it'll adjudicate it, and then it'll shoot out the resulting payment. And if you don't mind, I actually prepared a specific deadline list because I think, without knowing more right now, it's really important for providers to pay attention to these super tight deadlines. Because I think if you miss one deadline by one day, boom, you may have blown your ability to get paid any more than you actually received. So after you've received the initial payment or denial, you have 30 days as an out-of-network provider to reach out to the plan, the payer, and begin informal negotiations. This is called the open negotiations period. So it begins if you reach out within 30 days. And if you don't, you're stuck with what you got. Once you've begun that process within the 30 days, it triggers another 30-day period for you to actually negotiate. So you have 30 days to say, hey, let's negotiate. From the day that you reach out to the payer, you have another 30 days to begin and actually negotiate. If the parties don't agree to a payment amount at the end of the 30 days, and this is where I think it gets really tight.
It's hairy.
You have 4 days to initiate the federal IDR procedure.
What's IDR?
That is the internal dispute resolution process. In Texas, it's the arbitrator.
Yeah.
So the feds require a variety of different IDRs, which are third parties, unaffiliated with providers or payers. I think that you're going to need, the way the rules are written, multiple based on states or regions. However, these finally get approved to be the IDRs. And they're the people that are basically, at the end of the day, going to say what the rate is through a baseball style arbitration process, which means whoever wins, wins. There's not really a, let me cut the baby in half and, split the baby as the old wives.
So, okay, so you
goes.
got 4 days to say, I want to enter IDR.
Mm-hmm.
Then what?
After the 4 days with that selection, the parties have 3 days to try to reach their own agreement on the actual IDR provider. And as of the beginning of this week, we don't know who any of those actual IDR providers are going to be. So this is an open question just for attorneys who are trying to understand who is going to be, making the adjudication. We don't know yet. And there is a process for the departments to select those. Anyway, after that selection is done, if the parties can't select it within the 3 days, then HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, has 6 days to make the selection for the parties of who the IDR is going to be. Right. After that selection, the parties have 10 business days. And so, a little bit more flexibility. You get to do business days, not calendar days. But that's not a lot of time necessarily.
So, hold. So everything before that was calendar days?
Yes. Yes.
So you better hope it doesn't land on a holiday weekend.
I just lied to you. HHS gave themselves 6 business days to choose the IDR as well. But everything we had talked about before then is calendar days.
Oh my gosh!
I know. I think that this is a very
So
rocket
let
docket
me
if
just,
you want to use that term.
I want to keep this as non-political as I possibly can, so I will. This reminds me of another bill that was passed that has to do with our healthcare system that was many, many, many pages long, of which the majority of our politicians didn't read. But the reality of it is that all of this has basis, but yet again, we've created a bill that doesn't have appropriate implementation. It doesn't have an implementation plan that is realistic. So basically, we've created all this minutia because we've allowed politicians to do it, and we don't really have a great pathway for implementation. I mean, this is this is ridiculous.
Let's call it what it is. It's garbage.
It's ridiculous. 4 calendar days. I mean, you're an attorney. Listen, I mean, we know how the wheels of justice work. We understand how litigation works. 4 days. 4 days. I mean, it takes an attorney, no offense, 4 days to make the first phone call, if we're lucky.
Yeah,
but I mean, it's so unreasonable. And listen, I'm not even in this field, but I'm listening to this going, what?
Yeah.
There's no way. It's absurd.
Okay, so there's a couple more steps yet here, Tyler.
Yeah.
It's absurd. Is
Yeah,
what it is.
and we had only gotten to the selection of who's going to
Okay, well, let's keep going. Keep entertaining me.
Then you only have 10 business days after either the parties have selected or HHS has picked for you. You have 10 business days to submit the information justifying your payment. And there's a lot of strategy that I think that the new rules are going to require providers to think about when they're submitting that payment. Because in addition to giving you the process for IDR, the other set of rules that we have right now give us the process, or the methodology, I should say, for how we compute what a payment should be.
But here's the part of it I don't get, just from a sheer operational level. Let's take something, let's dumb this down to like trash pickup 7 days a week, right? That's like telling the trash truck, here's your regular route, but you need to do Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday's route on Monday. The reality is that how many hundreds of thousands of these claims are going to come into this 3 and 4 and 5 day process, whatever it is.
They're counting on it.
But within the first 12 months, this thing, I mean, the cog is going to be in the wheel. I mean, this whole thing is going to blow up. There's just no way that works.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions on the implementation of the IDR. There's a lot of questions. I mean, I don't think that the rules are unclear on how it should, timeline-wise, operate.
But do you believe that there's maybe not enough bodies and an operational experience that's going to make it realistic?
I think that no one has done themselves any favors, or done any favors for the IDR either, by having the deadlines as tight as they are.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and then what happens if you're in a state where there's only one IDR and you object to the IDR for a variety of different reasons? You know, you have to go around and they have to select a different IDR for you.
Sure hope it doesn't happen on Labor Day.
So I think that the schedules under the Act, both for the providers and the plans, are bordering on unreasonable. And so if there was any change that I thought would be, easy for the feds to do and would really benefit everyone in the system, maybe with the exception of patients, it would be to extend out these deadlines. Don't make them like civil litigation where it can take 2 years.
We don't need years.
No, but like you should be able in a 6-month period, initiate the conversation, go through your negotiations, put your strategy together, submit it, and get your result back. But do it in a way that lets people give the IDR the meaningful metrics that help them pick the right number.
I'm familiar with arbitration in other industries.
Mm-hmm.
And so walk me through, from your perspective, how an arbitration works in this arena. Because to me, the time frames are really tight. So how does that work?
Yeah. If let's just say you've gone through arbitration through the AAA, the American Arbitration Association. Mm-hmm. They have some rules that govern different types of arbitration, commercial arbitration, and others. And they they're more abbreviated than, say, the Texas Rules of Civil Procedure or the federal Rules of Civil Procedure would be. But they still give the parties meaningful opportunities to develop their case, develop the underlying facts, work with any experts to make your final, submission to the arbitrator at the hearing. Sometimes you don't even have an actual hearing. Here, these are like
that's what I'm asking. So how does it work here?
I mean, these would be tiny percentages of the time frame you would get in a regular commercial arbitration. Now, the issues are more narrow, right? You're not fighting about everything under the sun like sometimes happens in a real arbitration or litigation. So it is a narrow issue, but you've still got a lot of statistical data, price data, and other things that if I was a plan and a provider, I would both want to get to the IDR.
Yeah, I mean, I think where this is setting up, I think of one word.
Disaster.
I think chaos.
Mm-hmm.
This is setting itself up for absolute chaos for out-of-network providers.
It is.
And plans too. I think ERISA plans, not so much the BUCAs, the big payers I'm less worried about. But if you're a business and you're insuring,
if you're the employer,
you're insuring your employees through an ERISA plan. The plan is subject. Now, I'm not going over. That's not what our focus was today.
Yeah.
There's a whole nother presentation that we would give on what ERISA plans are required to do to comply. So,
and by the way, it wasn't like ERISA plans lacked complexity already.
Oh my God, yeah.
I mean, it's like it never ends.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why I'm proud not to have technically any employees. I mean, it has become such a litigious environment under ERISA, and now all we're going to do is just make it even worse.
Well, and one of the problems, in my opinion, under ERISA is the plan fiduciary. As long as they jump through certain hoops and show that they exercised
Like
appropriate discretion, then their ultimate determination is going to get upheld. What would have been a little better than putting this quick horse and pony show together would have been to go back to the underlying ERISA framework and start making tweaks to ERISA that help provide employees and employers with some cost efficiencies, not necessarily, give you an arbitration on a rocket docket.
Well, so, we've been talking for 40 minutes already. It's hard to believe that,
sorry.
right?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
And I'm sorry I'm this fired up, but
but that's
this
okay.
is absurd.
I mean, you want to hear some fired up people? Wait till this hits LinkedIn and Facebook and all these different groups that this goes into, because I think we're just going to light up our industry and all the healthcare providers that are about to listen to this.
And we've really just been talking about things at a 30,000 feet above the ground way. So I mean, pay attention to Weaver Johnson and Nelson website. We're beginning to put up information about the No Surprises Act, the rules that have just been implemented, and as they get finalized up into January, we're going to be updating that. You can also sign up for an email blast if you want to get an email letting you know we've put those up.
Yeah. So, look, one of my last questions for us today is, based on what's been published so far, based on the fact that we're in open comment period now and we're supposed to have final rules on 12/1, do you think there's any chance that this legislation could be delayed past 1/1 of 2022 for implementation?
No on implementation, potentially on enforcement of certain provisions. And let me tell you why I say it that way.
Okay. Explain.
So you have an act of Congress that says these things are going to happen on these different series of deadlines. And you three agencies go out and make me some rules. So the agencies have some flexibility on changing their rules. Even after a final rule's in place, there is a process under the Administrative Procedures Act for people to go and make changes to a rule. But it literally takes another act of Congress to change the deadlines that were in the statute itself. And so because the statute says do it, you would need, and maybe, if the Democrats get our stuff together and pass something, because you have 50, anyway, you could do something to alter that deadline in a bill that has to get passed before the
Do you
end
think
of the
that's
year.
happening before December 31?
Not a chance.
Not even a remote chance.
I'm just telling you.
Yeah, there's
I'm
too many
to answer
other-
your
there's too
question.
many
I don't
other
take a lot of
fights.
gambles, but
Right.
I'd gamble my house and cars on that.
That's the only way, though, that enforcement of, say, the IDR provisions, the patient consent to be balanced bill, i.e. the balanced billing ban, those things would need, in my opinion, an act of Congress to postpone their enforcement. Now, there are certain things that the agencies did with the price transparency requirements, where they said we don't have to we recognize the law comes into effect. It's effective. You need to be gathering this information
Sure.
and reporting it, but we're not going to begin enforcing those rules until a later date.
It's similar to what they did with Obamacare. I mean, that came out,
right.
but how long did it take them to actually start enforcing things, if they ever have in some areas? But that's a whole nother conversation. But that's a great point, is that you can unroll something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to, they're going to be pounding their gavel.
Yeah. So, okay. So I have one remaining question for me. Chris, you and I have talked about, we've talked about a lot of topics, but one of the questions that I've heard from providers is relative, and I just lost my train of thought. How about that? And it happens all the time, but I think there's still something that I haven't uncovered here, and it's relative to the appeals and dumping claims into this IDR process is what it's relative to. There was at some point something mentioned about you couldn't submit claims in mass under a business MPI, or you had to do it under the provider MPI, and you could only do one submission every 90 days or something like that. Is there something you recall reading about that? Because they were trying to limit how many submissions occurred, right, by payer or by provider.
Yeah, and I don't have the exact number at the tip of my tongue, but there are limits on your ability to bundle a certain number on the provider side, a certain number of claims together with a specific payer, to have them go through IDR together. You can bundle some together, and it alters the cost of what the IDR can charge based upon how many claims are bundled.
Right, but there's also if I recall correctly, there's also a frequency to how often you can dump claims into the IDR process, because they're trying to keep people from jamming up the lanes of traffic, right? Because there's only so many arbiters.
Yeah.
Oh, right now we don't even have any,
I mean,
yeah.
we don't know who they.
Sorry.
Right. I mean, man, maybe I should go try to be. Let me take a.
I'm
Let me go
changing
get.
careers.
I was
We're going to
actually-
chat.
Arbiters for Dummies. Anybody got a book?
We were laughing, me and one of our associates were laughing the other day, like maybe this is something that we shouldn't maybe not go and do the arbitration for providers. Let's try to be an IDR.
Yeah.
There's so many headaches, I think, on that front too.
So
Yeah.
I think the big takeaway for me in this whole thing is this is crazy complex, right?
It is, yes.
It is far from being settled. 12/1 is still 6 weeks away.
Right. And these are interim rules that can change.
Interim rules that can change, of course. But look, I think if people's head have been in the sand up until today, and all of a sudden they go, oh shit, I better try and figure something out and figure it out now. Otherwise, I just might be dead in the water. How do they get in touch with you? What do you recommend? What's a first step?
Give us a call or shoot us an email, and we're happy to, have a brief conversation on the phone, give you a little bit of background that might be, helpful to your specific provider type. Also, in terms of how the different payment structures are going to get made, there's geographical differences. So depending on where you are geographically, you need to take that into account too. But definitely reach out to us. You can go to our website and find all of our contact information. I'm Chris Reed. My email address is creed, REED, at weaverjohnston.com. And that's honestly the easiest way.
We'll make sure that our staff that helps run our podcast puts that in here at the bottom of our podcast on YouTube. So if you're listening to this,
that's right.
Refer to our YouTube page and go to the end of the podcast, and you'll be able to find it there. But Weaver Johnston is WeaverJohnston.com. WeaverJohnston.com. So, man, I can't thank you enough. You have any remaining comments or thoughts before we check out for this evening?
No, I appreciate y'all.
Yeah.
I will obviously be in touch with you as this continues to develop over the next 2 months before it's finally implemented. And if there's any massive changes, I'll definitely let you know. And either through a comment on the YouTube page or something, we can get that updated. But definitely, if people have questions, it's better to reach out and get those answered now than waiting until January 1st.
Absolutely. Well, Chris, thanks again.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks to our audience for tuning in. And this ought to be interesting to see how people respond. Until next week and next topic. So, in fact, next topic is going to be on Stark Law changes coming in 2022. So, back-to-back podcasts from our legal department at Weaver Johnston Nelson. So, tune in next week, and everybody be well. Have a good week.